What would you do if saving the one creature who never abandoned you cost you your job, your home, and your future? Most folks in Pine Hollow said Cole Bennett was a fool for throwing his life away over an old, half-lame horse. But when he spent his last $3 on a ruined cabin clinging to a frozen mountainside, they said he'd finally lost his mind. No one, not even Cole, could have imagined what that broken cabin, that battered ridge, and that dying winter storm were about to reveal. And if you think you know where this story is going, you don't. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. Let me tell you what really happened next. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the northern peaks like a white, merciless tide. The Bitterroot Valley lay buried under a sky the color of hammered steel, and every breath turned to frost the moment it left a man's lips. At Callaway Ranch, the wind cut through the fences and drifted across the pasture in long, ghost-like ribbons. The cattle moved sluggishly, their low, rasping bellows echoing across the frozen yard. Frost clung to the wooden rails and to the whiskers of every animal left standing. Cole Bennett pulled his coat tighter as he walked toward the barn. He had been through hard winters before, but never one that arrived 3 full weeks early. The hay reserves were already low, just a few bales stacked in the loft, and the ranch hands whispered among themselves, glancing nervously at the sky. Even the horses looked thinner than they should have. Their ribs showed faintly beneath winter coats that hadn't had time to thicken. Cole rested a hand on a post and looked across the field. Dusty stood apart from the others, the old gelding's gray coat mottled and worn, but his eyes, those eyes, still held fire. The kind of fire that didn't dim with age. But Winter didn't care about loyalty. Winter demanded sacrifice. By noon, Wade Calloway had gathered every ranch hand in the yard. The owner stood tall in his dark wool coat, a ledger tucked under one arm. Snowflakes clung to his beard as he cleared his throat, and every man fell silent. "We're cutting costs," Wade said, flipping open the ledger. "That means removing stock that can't earn its feed." He didn't sugarcoat it. He never did. The list he held was the death sentence for every horse too old, too slow, or too broken to be useful. A murmur rippled through the crew, resentment, resignation, fear. They had seen it coming, but that didn't make it easier. One by one, Wade read names. Horses that had pulled wagons for decades. Horses that had won rodeos in summers long gone. Horses that once belonged to men who were now in the ground. And then he said it. Dusty. A few men nodded to each other. "Should have been done 2 winters ago," someone muttered. Cole swallowed hard. Dusty's ears twitched at the sound of his name, but the old horse didn't move. He simply lifted his head, looking at Cole with the slow, steady awareness of a creature who had survived more winters than most men ever would. Cole clenched his fists to keep them from shaking. Wade strode across the yard and stopped in front of Cole. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he pulled a Colt .45 from his coat. "You've looked after that horse for 10 years, he said. "You end it." The gun felt heavier than iron as Wade pressed it into Cole's palm. Cole stared down at it. "Wade." "He's not suffering. He's eating more than he earns," Wade replied, voice flat. "This winter will take enough from us. I'm not letting it take profit too." Cole didn't move. Wade's eyes narrowed. "You do it or you walk." The wind howled across the yard, rattling the loose boards of the barn. Every ranch hand watched, waiting. Cole walked toward Dusty, the gun cold against his thigh. His breath came out unsteady as he approached the gelding who had once carried him through the most dangerous ride of his life. Dusty didn't back away, didn't even flinch. The horse simply looked at him, deep, dark eyes full of trust so absolute, it broke something inside Cole's chest. Memories surged up like an avalanche, a rodeo arena. Dusty pivoting sharp, to save Cole from hitting the fence. Long nights riding fence line together. Quiet mornings where the old horse nudged his shoulder as if reminding him he wasn't alone. Cole lifted the gun, but his finger couldn't tighten around the trigger. He whispered, "I'm not doing this. Not to you." Dusty exhaled softly as if he understood. Behind him, boots stomped across the frozen ground. Wade snatched the gun from Cole's hand. "You're done here," Wade growled. "Take that useless animal and get off my property." The ranch yard fell into heavy silence. Men looked up from their work, some amused, others pitying. One man snorted, "Loyalty won't keep you warm, Benny." Another shook his head. "Imagine losing your job over a lame horse." Cole didn't say a word. If he opened his mouth, he wasn't sure whether fury or grief would spill out. He turned away, jaw tight. It took him only minutes to gather what little he owned, a threadbare wool blanket, a skinning knife, a half-full canteen, and Dusty's worn saddle. He tied it all down carefully. His breath fogged the air as he buckled the girth strap. No one approached. No one said goodbye. The ranch that had been his home for a decade now looked foreign, distant, cold. Cole placed a hand on Dusty's neck. "Come on, old boy. Looks like it's just us now." He led the horse down the rutted road, boots crunching on frozen mud. The wind blew against them in long, lonely gusts. Behind him, the ranch shrank into a smear of brown and white. Not once did Cole look back. Pine Hollow wasn't much kinder. As Cole and Dusty walked down the main street, people paused in their errands to stare. Not openly cruel, just dismissive. Judgment simmered in their expressions. A woman whispered to her friend, if Calloway fired him, he must have done something real stupid. A man laughed under his breath. "Ran off with a broken horse. That's rich." Cole lowered his gaze. Dusty walked close enough that their shoulders brushed. Somehow that helped. He'd never felt so alone. At the front of the sheriff's office hung a warped wooden sign with a paper tacked to it. The edges curled like the dying leaves of autumn. "Property abandoned, $3 North Ridge Cabin." A pair of men standing nearby chuckled. A death trap, that cabin. Nobody's lasted a winter up there. Cole stood motionless, staring at the notice. $3. $3 was all he had left. And a decision like this, it wasn't just desperation. It was survival. Behind him, the sheriff's door creaked open. Sheriff Miller stepped outside, tugging his coat tight. The man had the kind of face weathered by both storms and years of keeping the peace. "You thinking about that cabin?" he asked. Cole nodded once. The sheriff sighed. "That place is set on stone. Hard as iron and twice as cold. Winds hit that ridge first, hardest and longest. No one's made it through a January up there." "I only need a place to stand," Cole said quietly. Miller studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in. We'll do the paperwork." Inside, the sheriff placed a battered ledger on his desk. Cole reached into his wallet and pulled out the last of his savings, 3 tarnished silver coins. They clinked softly on the wood. "That all you got?" Miller asked. "That's all I need," Cole replied. The sheriff let out a breath, equal parts frustration and respect. "All right, let's get your name on this." Cole signed the deed, his handwriting stiff from cold and maybe from fear. The paper was thin, almost fragile, but it felt as heavy as fate. "Hope you know what you're doing," Miller said. Cole didn't answer. He wasn't sure he did. By the time Cole and Dusty reached the edge of town, the sun had begun to fall behind the western hills, turning the sky a deep copper. The ridge loomed ahead, a jagged backbone of stone rising from the forest, like the spine of a giant. Snowflakes drifted lazily at first, then thickened. Cole pulled his coat tighter and urged Dusty forward. The climb was steep, and each step dragged them higher into the wind's teeth. Gusts slammed into them, pushing Cole sideways. Dusty braced himself, planting his hooves steadily despite his age. The ridge trail wound between pine trees bent from years of winter storms. Cole's breath burned in his chest. His cheeks stung, but he didn't stop. What about you? Would you risk your job just to save an old horse everyone else had given up on? And could a $3 cabin on a frozen ridge really become the place that changes everything? Tell us what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most powerful part of the story. When they crested the final rise, the cabin came into view. If one could still call it a cabin. The wind swept across an open stretch of frozen ground, hammering the skeletal structure as if trying to erase it from existence. The logs were cracked and gray, the crossbeams bowed from years of snow pressing down without mercy. Nearly half the roof had collapsed inward, leaving a jagged hole that opened to the blackening sky. Snow had drifted across the floor inside, forming a crusted mound as solid as rock. The front door hung crookedly from one surviving hinge, tapping against the frame every time a gust hit it. Cole let out a long breath, watching the steam curl into the air. "Well," he murmured, "this is what $3 buys you." Dusty snorted, lowering his head. Cole couldn't tell if the horse was annoyed, confused, or simply cold. Maybe all three. He stepped inside first. The floor groaned beneath his boots. The shadows in the corners felt thick and watchful, and every draft that passed through the open gaps in the walls stung like needles. Cole touched one of the logs, dry, splintering, brittle. Still, it was 4 walls. It was a roof. Or at least enough of one to start with. It's something he whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it. As dusk sank into the ridge, Cole gathered what scraps of wood he could find, damp pieces half-rotted from years of neglect, and tried to coax them into a fire using a stone and flint. Sparks leapt up, died, leapt again, until finally a small flame took hold. It struggled, wheezed, then caught with a weak, sputtering glow. The smoke, however, had nowhere to go. The collapsed chimney sent it swirling back into the room. Cole coughed, eyes watering, pushing air with his hat to keep from choking. He dragged his bedroll, a thin wool blanket, and a fraying pad into the corner, where the wind blew least violently. Gusts screamed through the cracks in the walls, long and hollow, like the wail of something mourning the mountain itself. Cole curled tightly beneath the blanket boots, still on breath turning to frost above his face. He tried to sleep, but the cold slipped beneath his skin, gnawing at flesh and bone. Each time the wind slammed the loose boards, he jerked awake. Outside, Dusty stood beneath a slanted piece of wood Cole had propped up as a temporary shelter. The horse's breath puffed steadily in the dark, though the shiver running down his spine exposed the truth. Neither of them were going to last long like this. "I'm sorry, boy," Cole whispered into the night, knowing Dusty could hear him. "We'll figure it out." Sleep eventually came, not softly, but the way exhaustion finally overtakes a man fighting too many battles at once. A crunching sound woke him. Not wind, not branches. Footsteps. Cole bolted upright. A faint gray light filtered through the half-roof as a silhouette stepped into the doorway. The figure was stooped but sturdy, wrapped in layered furs that made her look like part of the forest had grown legs. She held something steaming in her hand. Cole reached for his knife. "Who's there?" "No one worth stabbing," the woman replied bluntly. Her breath curled out in white ribbons. "Drink this before your insides freeze." She handed him a tin cup. Coffee, hot, bitter, and smelling faintly of smoke. He held it between both hands, as if it were a gift from heaven. Name's Nora Whitmore, she said. Live out past the eastern woods. Cole nodded cautiously. Cole Bennett. She looked around the ruined cabin without stepping farther in. Her eyes sharp, despite the creases around them, took in every gap, break, and hole. You'll die up here if you leave it like this, she said matter-of-factly. Cole stiffened. I'll manage. That attitude is how most fools end up frozen into the ridge come February. Nora said, as she set a rusted trowel on the rickety table. You need earth. Clay, the good kind. He blinked. Clay, to seal the walls. I'll show you. She turned, without waiting, her fur hood bobbing, as she headed toward the trees. Cole hesitated only a moment before grabbing his coat and following her. Nora led him to a narrow stream tucked between rocks. Its surface was frozen, but the ice was thin just enough to cover what lay beneath. She tapped the ice with her cane. Dig here, below the frost line. Cole knelt, breaking through with the butt of his knife. Frigid water seeped up. Beneath it, dark mud clung to the blade. That, Nora said, is what'll keep the wind out. Dark clay holds better. Sticks to the logs. Cole nodded, rolling up his sleeves. You patch the walls first. Roof comes next. If you do it backwards, you'll choke to death on your own smoke. He looked up at her, but she was already turning away. One last thing she added. Work fast. Weather's turning. And just like that, she disappeared into the trees, leaving Cole with a stream of trowel and the daunting weight of a cabin that needed more help than he knew how to give. The first bucket of clay was so cold, it burned. Cole's fingers stiffened instantly, but he kept going. The ice crust was thick, and each swing of the tool jarred his bones. When he finally managed to scoop out enough mud to fill the bucket, he discovered something worse. Wet clay was heavy. He hauled the first bucket up the slope muscles, screaming breath turning into a stinging cloud. By the time he reached the cabin, sweat had soaked through his shirt, then froze solid the next moment. Dusty stood nearby watching him with quiet patience. Don't look at me like that, Cole muttered. We need this. He carried load after load, each one harder than the last. His legs trembled, his shoulders throbbed. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Once he had enough clay, Cole gathered dry grass from the ridge. He kneaded it together with the clay, forming a thick, sticky paste. The mixture clung to his hands like cold tar. He pressed the clay into gaps between the logs. At first, the wind blasted straight through, nearly stripping the wet mud from his fingers. The first layer froze and cracked. Cole swore under his breath. He ran back to the stream, filled a bucket with the coldest water he had ever touched, and heated it over the weak fire. Warm clay held better. The next layer stuck. Slowly, painfully slowly, the walls stopped hissing with every gust. Sunset turned the mountains to molten gold. Cole's arms hung like weights from his shoulders, his back bending with fatigue. But he kept packing clay until he could no longer feel his fingertips. Dusty approached once, touching Cole's sleeve lightly with his muzzle. Cole leaned against the horse's neck for a moment, letting the warmth steady him. Just a little more, he whispered. By the time the last gap was sealed, Cole's hands were raw. The cold split his skin open, thin red lines blooming across his knuckles. Blood smeared into the clay, drying like rust. But he didn't stop. When a piece of clay slipped, he pressed harder. When the wind sucked warmth from his bones, he gritted his teeth and worked faster. Every night, Dusty stood close as if trying to shield him from the cold. That night, for the first time, the wind didn't scream through the walls. It moaned, yes, but from outside. Inside, the air held still enough for the fire to warm 2 whole corners. Cole sat near the small flame, feeling heat gather around his boots. His breath didn't freeze instantly. His fingers tingled rather than went numb. It wasn't much, but it was hope. The next morning, hoofbeats approached through the snow. Cole stepped outside, hand on his knife, until he recognized the rider. Caleb Hayes, Pine Hollow's blacksmith. He dismounted slowly. "Sheriff told me you bought the ridge cabin." Cole nodded, trying to make it livable. Caleb surveyed the structure with a craftsman's eye. "Chimney's shot. You won't survive the next storm without fixing it." He opened his saddlebag, revealing tools, hammers, chisels, wedges. Cole blinked. "You're helping?" Caleb shrugged. "I don't feel like boring another fool this winter." Coming from Caleb, that was practically affection. Together, they cleared the fallen stones, separating those that could still be used. Caleb taught Cole how to mix clay thick enough to bind masonry. They hauled stones from the tree line, stacking them into a new base. Cole's breath fogged so heavily, it looked like smoke on its own. His hands shook from fatigue, but the rhythm of the work steadied him. Hours passed with only the crack of stone and the whistle of wind. At last, Caleb stepped back. "Try it." Cole lit a handful of kindling. The smoke rose straight up out the chimney, not back into the room. Caleb nodded, satisfied. "You're getting there?" He left his hammer and a box of nails. "Fix the roof. Storm's coming." Cole climbed onto the cabin with the last of the daylight fading. The wind shoved against him, trying to knock him off. He pressed his boots into the wood and tore away rotten planks. He patched the holes with whatever wood remained, then stitched old grain sacks into a makeshift barrier beneath new planks. Every strike of the hammer echoed across the ridge. Nails bit deep into the beams. At one point, the wind hit so hard, he nearly slid off, catching himself on a ragged crossbeam. He hung there, heart pounding, then pulled himself back up. "Not dying today," he muttered. By the time he climbed down, night had swallowed the ridge. But the roof held. Dusty whinnied softly, a small, triumphant sound. Over the next day, Cole studied the wind. He noticed how the ridge deflected the western gusts, but funneled the northern ones straight at the cabin. He angled the roof slightly, weighted the edges with stones, and reinforced the support beam inside with 2 scavenged logs. Every adjustment made the structure just a little more solid, a little more alive. By the end of the week, the cabin no longer felt like a tomb. It wasn't warm, not by any stretch, but it wasn't deadly. Dusty had a wind-sheltered corner to stand in. Cole could warm food without choking on smoke. The walls hummed, but didn't scream. On the first night, he slept without shivering violently. Cole sat beside Dusty, sharing a handful of oats between them. "We might just make it," he whispered. Dusty nudged him gently. Cole smiled for the first time since the ranch gates closed behind him. The cabin wasn't much, but it was life. And soon, very soon, it would be the only thing standing between Pine Hollow and the storm no one was prepared for. The day the storm finally came, it didn't announce itself with thunder or dark rolling clouds. It arrived first as silence. The ridge had grown familiar to Cole by then. The wind was a constant companion, sometimes a low whistle, sometimes a ragged howl, but always there. That morning, though, as he stepped outside to toss a few forkfuls of hay into Dusty's makeshift pen, the air felt wrong. There was no wind, no movement. The world held its breath. Sound seemed to fall flat. Even the creak of the cabin door felt muffled. Cole's ears rang faintly like after a gunshot, though he hadn't fired a shot in days. He frowned and looked up. The sky had turned the color of dirty wool. The line of the horizon was gone, swallowed by a gray haze that blurred the mountains into the clouds. There was no definition anymore, just a heavy ceiling, low and oppressive. He'd seen this once before years ago, back when he'd still been a ranch hand at Callaway. That storm had torn down 2 barns, buried cattle alive. A quiet like this meant something big was circling. Behind him, Dusty struck the frozen ground with his hoof. Once, twice, then again faster. Cole turned. The old gelding stood rigid, muscles tight beneath his winter coat. His ears were pricked forward, locked on some invisible point to the north. Every few seconds, he stamped the ground again, iron shoe hitting ice with a sharp, anxious crack. "Easy, boy," Cole murmured, stepping closer. Dusty didn't relax. His breath came fast and heavy, puffing into the air in short white bursts. He paced in a small, tense circle, then stopped and stared north once more, as if he could hear something moving out there beyond human range. As if the storm had a heartbeat. Cole lifted the hay bucket toward him, but Dusty didn't even sniff at it. He backed away from the food eyes, never leaving the gray smear of the northern sky. The last time Cole had seen a horse refuse to eat like that, a tornado had ripped the roof off a distant homestead an hour later. He swallowed. "All right," he said softly. "I hear you." He turned back toward the cabin and squinted up at the clouds. High above the gray, wasn't flat after all. If he looked carefully, he could see the faintest curl in it, clouds twisting slowly in wide, lazy circles, like smoke drawing down a drain. The air grew colder in an instant, as if someone had reached into the valley and scooped the warmth away. The hair rose at the back of Cole's neck. Caleb's words echoed in his memory. "If the big winds come from the north, there's nowhere to run. You hunker down or you die." Cole didn't waste another second. He went back inside, moving quickly now. He dragged every last piece of firewood closer to the hearth, stacking it within arm's reach. The pile that had felt generous 2 days ago suddenly looked small, fragile, in the face of whatever was coming. At the door, he wedged flat stones along the base, packing them tight so the wind wouldn't slam it open. Then he stepped back outside, tightened the rope securing Dusty's shelter, and checked every knot twice. Finally, he walked once more around the cabin, pressing his palms flat against the clay-lined walls. The surface was cold, but most of it didn't leak. Only in a couple of thin spots did a faint whisper of air bleed through. He made a mental note of them. This would be the test. Everything he'd done to the cabin, every shovelful of clay, every nail in the roof, would either hold or rip apart. By the time darkness fell, the silence had become unbearable. It felt like standing in the middle of a crowd that was trying not to breathe. Then the first gust hit. It came like a beast charging down the mountain, slamming into the ridge with a roar that rattled every bone in Cole's body. The cabin shuddered. Dust choked the air inside as it poured out of long, dormant cracks. Outside, the wind found its voice. It howled across the cabin around it, through the trees rising in pitch, until it sounded less like weather and more like something alive, the scream of a furious animal tearing at the earth. Snow followed. Not the gentle drifting flakes that soft-edge the valley on mild days, but sheets whirling, blinding, savage. The storm didn't fall from the sky. It attacked sideways, driven by the gale. White walls of ice-laden powder slammed against the cabin, each impact making the logs creak. Cole braced his shoulder against the door as it bucked under the force. "Not today," he grunted through his teeth. A crack opened between the door and frame, and a blade of cold sliced into the room. Cole shoved harder until the wood settled back into place. He dropped a heavy brace across it, anchoring it to the jamb. Inside, the fire swung wildly, licking at the stones of the hearth as drafts snuck in from unseen places. Shadows jittered along the walls. The little cabin felt suddenly tiny, a wooden box being kicked around by an angry giant. Outside, the wind rose to a shriek. It tore at the roof, yanked at the eaves, slid its fingers under every edge it could find. The old boards groaned in protest. The sound built until it was like a train, barreling through the mountains unseen but deafening. Cups rattled on the rough-hewn table. Nails squealed in their holes. Cole lifted his eyes to the ceiling. A hairline crack raced its way along one beam, dust sifting down like flour. Somewhere above, something heavy scraped and shifted the whole structure, giving a panicked shiver. Then came the crash. It slammed through the storm's roar, a single brutal impact that shook the cabin so violently, ash tumbled from the mouth of the chimney, smothering half the fire. The air filled with soot. Cole choked, coughing, then bolted to the door, yanking his coat over his head. The second he stepped outside, the wind punched the breath out of him. It nearly threw him backward, and only a desperate grab at the doorframe kept him from tumbling into the snow. He squinted upward through stinging ice. A large pine limb, thick as his torso, had snapped off a nearby tree and come down across the roof like a fallen spear. It had smashed through the planks, leaving a jagged hole where snow gushed in, pouring straight into the cabin. Perfect. A hole in the one place he could least afford it. Cole slammed the doors shut and stumbled back inside. Already a thin crust of snow was forming on the floor, melting into icy puddles near the hearth. Flakes drifted down in a relentless stream from the breach overhead. He grabbed a wool blanket and flung it over his head, trying to catch the incoming snow, but the blanket instantly billowed and ripped free under the inbound air. This storm wasn't going to be patched with cloth and good intentions. There was only one option, and he hated it. He had to go up. In the dim light, he tied a length of rope around his waist, securing the other end to a heavy beam inside the cabin. The knot was clumsy with cold fingers, so he retied it twice. Then he grabbed a hammer, a handful of nails, and one of the last wide planks he had left. "Stay with me, boy," he muttered to Dusty as he passed. The horse huddled low against the wind in his little shelter, tossed his head, but didn't bolt. His eyes were wide, but steady. Cole hauled himself up through the half-broken rafters and pushed out onto the roof. The storm hit him like a wall. Snow and ice and wind collided with his body, ripping at his coat and stinging his face. It was like trying to stand on the deck of a ship in a storm at sea. The world had narrowed to white, no horizon, no sky, no ground, just a screaming, swirling chaos. He flattened himself against the roof elbows and knees spread wide. His fingers clawed at the rough wood as the wind tried again to pry him loose. "Come on," he hissed, forcing himself to move. Every step was a fight. He crawled toward the new hole, dragging the board with him. The ridgepole lurched beneath his weight, the entire structure flexing like a bow. He reached the limb and the shattered planks around it, then heaved the limb aside, inch by inch, until it slid off the roof and vanished into the white void below. Working by feel more than sight, he wrestled the board into place over the gaping wound. His hammer hand shook as he drove the first nail home. Every blow jarred his arm up to the shoulder. Every swing of the hammer was stolen from him by the wind before the sound could even reach his ears. The storm screamed into his face, tearing tears from his eyes. His fingers went numb, his knuckles splitting open on the handle. Blood spotted the board, then froze. He barely noticed. Another nail. Another. The rope around his waist went taut, once jerking suddenly as a gust lifted him just enough to make his boots lose purchase. He slammed back down, hard ribs bruising against the roof. "Not yet," he growled. "You don't get to take this from me." Somewhere beneath him, through flashing glimpses of lightning and swirling snow, he saw Dusty, just a gray blur in the storm, standing square in front of his little stall, body planted like a wall to shield the entrance from the worst of the wind. Snow battered his flanks, but he held his ground. That sight gave Cole just enough strength to finish the job. At last the board was fixed, each nail hammered deep. The hole wasn't pretty, but it was covered. Cole shoved another piece of wood against the seam, wedging it tight. Then he crawled back toward the edge muscles, trembling lungs burning. He dropped back into the cabin like a man falling into another world. Inside, it was still chaos, but survivable chaos. Snow still sifted in from a dozen hairline cracks, but the torrent from the ceiling had dwindled to a faint dusting. The fire had nearly died. He knelt, coaxing it back to life with shivering hands and slivers of dry kindling he'd hidden under the cot. Outside, the storm howled. It howled for hours, then for a full day, then for another. The blizzard didn't blow through and move on. It sat on the valley like a wrathful god, grinding wind and ice together until even the trees groaned. Snow piled against the cabin walls, creeping higher, higher, until it pressed against the windows like a frozen tide. More than once, Cole had to dig his way out, just to get to the woodpile shovel carving a narrow tunnel from door to stacked logs and back again. The wind tried to fill that tunnel in the moment he turned his back. Sleep became something he grabbed in thin, ragged snatches between feeding the fire and checking on Dusty. His hands cracked open in new places every day, the skin red and raw, but he kept feeding wood to the flames, kept sealing any tiny draft he could find with handfuls of clay, warmed by the hearth. Through it all, the clay walls held. They shivered, but they didn't break. The wind battered them, but they refused to let it in. On the third morning, Cole woke to silence. Real silence. No wind, no rattling. Just the soft ticking of cooling wood and the faint sigh of embers. He pushed himself up, every muscle aching, and went to the door. When he tried to swing it open, it stopped dead after moving only a few inches. Snow. He grabbed the iron skillet, used it like a shovel, hacking away until he had carved a narrow opening. He squeezed through and climbed up. The ridge was unrecognizable. The landscape had become a white ocean, waves of snow frozen mid-crest. Trees lay broken and half their tops buried. The creek bed was gone, smoothed over completely. The sky was clear now, a hard, cold blue. He turned toward the valley. From the ridge, he could see Pine Hollow spread out below like a model built from matchsticks and then crushed. Barn roofs had collapsed under the weight of the snow. The church steeple had snapped, the bell tower caved in. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, weak and thin. He felt an icy stone settle in his chest. Down there they were exposed. Up here he'd barely survived with clay walls and a fortified roof. Down there. He swallowed, throat tight. The cabin behind him stood solid and unbroken. For all its scars, it had held. A $3 ruin, now the strongest shelter on the ridge. He had no idea yet that the valley was already on its way to him. 2 days later, Pine Hollow began to move. The storm had taken nearly everything: roofs, fences, livestock, warmth, but it hadn't taken hunger. It hadn't taken the primal instinct that drove people to seek fire and shelter wherever they could find it. Sheriff Tom Miller stood on a small rise overlooking the town, hands stuffed into his coat, scanning the damage. Smoke no longer twisted from most chimneys. In some cases, there was nothing left for smoke to come from. Families huddled around makeshift fires in the street, their houses too damaged to re-enter. Children cried quietly, clinging to their mothers' skirts. Men walked with dazed, hollow eyes. The sheriff's gaze traveled beyond the town, up toward the mountains, and stopped. A thin column of smoke rose from the north ridge, straight and steady. He narrowed his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. He did it. He turned back to the people behind him. "All right," he called out. His voice carried more authority than volume. Everyone nearby turned. We've got one place still standing with fire in the chimney. The ridge cabin. We're moving. He organized them quickly, prioritizing the very young, the very old, the sick. Those who could walk carried those who couldn't. Those who were strongest pulled makeshift sleds loaded with blankets and what little food remained. Wade Calloway was among them. The storm had stripped him just as thoroughly as it had stripped the land. His fine coat was torn, his hair matted with ice, his face pale and drawn. He said nothing as they began to climb. For once, the man who always had an opinion kept it to himself. The path up to the ridge was half buried. Snow rose to their knees and then their thighs. Men broke trails stumbling, slipping, hauling themselves up with gloved hands. Sheriff Miller trudged at the front, leaning on his stick breath, pluming in front of him. Behind them, Pine Hollow sagged in silence. Ahead, the cabin's little plume of smoke climbed into the sky like a beacon. Cole heard them before he saw them, the crunch of many footsteps, the muffled murmur of tired voices, the ragged cough of someone who'd breathed too much cold air. He stood from the fire heart, tripping in his chest, and grabbed the iron poker. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it felt solid in his hand. He moved to the door, every sense alert. The knock that came wasn't timid. 3 hard raps, spaced evenly. Cole Sheriff Miller's voice hoarse but strong. "It's Tom. We need a place to bring people. You open in that door." Cole glanced over his shoulder. Dusty stood in his stall, head raised, ears forward, but not nervous. If anything, the old horse looked steady, as if he understood exactly why they were here. "Yeah," Cole said quietly, almost to himself. "Yeah. We're open." He set the poker aside, slid back the wooden bar, and pulled the door inward. Wind slipped inside, carrying with it a line of faces, exhausted, pale, desperate. Mothers clutching children. Old men hunched under the weight of blankets. Sheriff Miller, eyes rimmed with red. And just behind him, Wade Calloway, stripped of his swagger, gaze lowered. "Can we come in?" the sheriff asked, though they both knew the question was more courtesy than necessity. Cole stepped back, opening the door wide. "Get them to the fire." The cabin filled quickly. People pressed in as close as they could, hands reaching toward the flames, shoulders shaking as thawing fingers began to hurt. Someone started crying, the sound of relief, more than grief. Cole tossed more wood onto the fire, watching the flame leap higher, then moved aside so an old woman could sit on his stool. He filled a pot with snow, set it over the flames to melt. Water first, food later. "Didn't think this place would be the last one standing," Sheriff Miller admitted, looking around in quiet amazement. Cole huffed a tired half-laugh. "Didn't think I'd be the one inside it." "Life's funny that way," the sheriff said. "Sometimes the decisions that look stupid up close end up saving everyone." Children, their cheeks raw from windburn, huddled together on the floor, shoulders pressed to the warm clay walls. A couple of teenagers, trying to hide how shaken they were, helped Cole rearrange what little furniture he had so more people could lie down. Outside, Dusty stood in his small shelter, breathing deeply, watching the flurry of movement with calm eyes. After a while, Cole led the horse into a more sheltered lean-to he'd reinforced along the cabin's side, stuffing extra straw under his hooves. One little boy, no more than 6, reached up with trembling fingers to touch Dusty's neck. The old horse lowered his head, letting the child's hand rest there. Cole's chest tightened. The storm had taken so much, but somehow this old animal had made it through. By the second night, another problem emerged. Water. The snow on the ridge was plentiful, sure, but melting. It took time and fuel, and the valley wells below had frozen solid straight through. The little stream that had once flowed near the trees was buried its surface, hardened into a smooth, impenetrable sheet of ice. "We can't keep this many people going on melted snow alone," Sheriff Miller said quietly, watching the thin trickle pour from the pot into a line of tin cups. There's not enough wood. Cole knew he was right. The fire was eating through the woodpile at a dangerous pace. No water meant dehydration. No fire meant death. He scrubbed a hand over his face, trying to think. A sharp clang startled him. He turned just in time to see Dusty slam his hoof against the stall door once, twice, then toss his head toward the back of the cabin. The horse's ears pricked with intent, not fear. "You hear something?" Boy Cole asked. Dusty pawed the ground again, then stepped sideways, bumping his shoulder against the gate. "All right," Cole murmured. "Show me." He grabbed his coat and followed Dusty out through the rear, lean-to the two of them, pushing against the knee-deep drifts. The wind had calmed, but the cold still bit savagely. Dusty moved with purpose, picking his way along the cabin's backside until he stopped at a spot where the snow seemed piled just a little higher, a little smoother. He stomped there hard, then again, snorting clouds of steam. Cole frowned. "You sure?" Dusty responded by clawing at the snow, scraping away clumps with his hoof. Cole dropped to his knees, helping. Together, man and horse dug down until the packed crust gave way to something darker. The smell hit him first, not dirt, not ice. Earth. Damp, alive earth. He scraped faster. Beneath the compacted snow and thin layer of frost, the ground glistened wet, not frozen all the way through. A tiny trickle of water seeped between the rocks, running in a narrow vein down toward the slope. Cole stared at it, stunned. The stone underneath part of the ridge's spine held just enough of the earth's deep warmth to keep this narrow channel from freezing solid. Protected by snowdrifts and the slope of the hill, it had survived the worst the blizzard could throw at it. He laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that startled Dusty. "You clever old thing," he said, voice rough. "You remembered." He grabbed a shovel, widened the opening, and followed the thin stream to where it pooled in a shallow hollow. The water was icy, but liquid. Drinkable. The only water he'd seen that wasn't locked in ice. He filled 2 buckets and hurried back inside. The reaction was instant. Eyes widened, hands trembled as people took the cups he handed them. "It's not snow water," one woman asked, surprised by how it went down. "No," Cole said. "Natural spring, up behind the cabin. Must be fed from under the rock." Sheriff Miller met his gaze over the rim of his mug. "You just found the only steady water source in this valley right now." "I didn't," Cole said quietly. "Dusty did." The sheriff glanced toward the door where the outline of the old horse could be seen through the thin walls. "Then, we owe that animal a whole lot more than anyone thought." Later, when the worst of the panic had passed, Wade Calloway came to stand beside Cole near the back of the cabin. His shoulders looked smaller somehow, like the storm had sanded down whatever pride had once propped them up. He watched as another bucket of water was carried in, children reaching for it with eager hands. "That the spring?" he asked. Cole nodded. "And the horse found it." Wade's gaze drifted toward Dusty, who stood calmly chewing a mouthful of hay as if he hadn't just saved an entire town. For a long moment, Wade said nothing. The crackle of the fire and the murmur of quiet conversation filled the gaps between them. "I was wrong about him," Wade said at last, the words dragged up from somewhere deep. "About you, too." Cole didn't answer. He simply laid a hand on Dusty's neck, feeling the steady warmth under his fingers. "You called him useless," he said finally, not accusing, just stating fact. Wade exhaled a tired, shuddering breath. "Yeah, I did." He watched as a little girl patted Dusty's nose, giggling for the first time in days. "Looks like I didn't know the first thing about value," Wade admitted. "Not the kind that matters when the sky turns mean." Cole kept his eyes on Dusty. Value's not always something you see on a balance sheet. Wade gave a faint wry smile. Seems the storm taught all of us that. He stepped back then, leaving Cole and Dusty by the door, the man who had refused to pull the trigger, and the horse everyone had given up on now, the quiet guardians of a town that would have frozen without them. Outside, the ridge stood firm against the pale, distant sun, the little column of smoke from the cabin curling into the cold blue sky like a promise. In the days after the blizzard finally broke, Pine Hollow moved like someone waking up from a beating. The air was still cold enough to burn lungs, but the sky had softened from iron to a hard, brittle blue. Men dug out doorways. Women picked through splintered walls trying to salvage anything that hadn't been crushed. Children stood and stared at the ruins of the only homes they'd ever known. Word of what had happened on the ridge spread faster than any wagon could roll. So when the riders from Helena came, no one was surprised. They arrived in a line of dark horses' coats, buttoned up to their chins, leather satchels strapped behind their saddles. The lead man introduced himself as Mr. Henderson, from the Territorial Land Office, voice brisk, eyes sharp, in the way of someone sent to count losses and turn them into reports. He and his men walked the streets with notebooks in hand, jotting down the cost of broken structures. One collapsed church, 2 barns totaled 12 homes, partially destroyed 3 beyond repair. They assessed the roads, the bridges, the frozen-over wells. Every crack and splinter was measured with the cool efficiency of bureaucracy. But when they stopped to rest at the saloon nursing cups of bitter coffee, the talk among the townsfolk wasn't of what had fallen. It was about what hadn't. Storm took the roofs clean off down here, Sheriff Miller told them. But there's one place that didn't budge. Up on the North Ridge, a $3 cabin everyone thought was a joke. A joke, Henderson asked, eyebrow raised. Was the sheriff said. Now it's the reason you're not counting bodies instead of houses. That got their attention. Within the hour, Henderson and 2 of his men were riding toward the ridge, guided by a ranch hand who'd been there the night they took shelter inside. The trail was still half choked with drifts. Their horses labored up the slope, hooves slipping on patches of ice, breath puffing in steady clouds. When they finally crested the rise and the ridge flattened out, the riders all drew up at once. The cabin stood ahead of them. It wasn't pretty. The logs were scarred, the roof patched with mismatched planks and weighted by boulders. Clay had been smeared between the logs in thick, rough bands that still bore the marks of human hands and split knuckles. But it stood. Every wall, every beam, every stone of the chimney, which still sent up that steady thread of smoke. One of the land office men let out a low whistle. Hell, he muttered it. Not only survived, it looks better than half the places in town. Henderson dismounted slowly, eyes narrowed as he circled the structure. He pressed his fingers to the clay-chinked wall, rapped his knuckles against the logs, inspected the angle of the roof in relation to the prevailing wind. This was done with the ridge in mind, he said. Whoever built this wasn't following a plan on paper. He was listening to the land. The door opened behind him. Cole stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag, surprised to see 3 strangers in government coats standing in his yard. Dusty lifted his head from the hay pile, ears twitching. "Morning," Cole said cautiously. Henderson stepped forward and held out his hand. "Mr. Bennett, I presume name's Henderson. Territorial Land Office. I've been hearing about your cabin." "Most folks have," Cole replied wryly. "Couple months ago, they all thought I'd freeze to death in it." "And now," Henderson said, glancing back at the structure, "you've got the only building in a 50-mile radius that stood up to the worst storm anyone can remember." He gripped Cole's hand tightly. "You understand the way wind and earth move on this ridge better than any map we've got in Helena." Cole shrugged. I just didn't want to die. Sometimes Henderson said that's all good engineering really is. They walked the perimeter together. Cole explained how he'd found the clay, how Nora had told him to seal the walls before touching the roof, how Caleb had helped him rebuild the chimney. He pointed out how the ridge broke the western gales, but funneled the northern blasts straight down the line, forcing him to angle the roof just so. Henderson listened, asking few questions, but remembering everything. When they stepped back into the cabin, warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. The clay walls trapped heat, the hearthstone radiated it. The scars of the storm were still visible, a crack here, a patch there, but the structure felt solid. Alive, even. Henderson turned to Cole. "We're planning a series of storm shelters," he said, "spread across the territory. Places people can reach when the sky decides to turn on them. I've seen plans drawn up by men with education back east, but none of them have lived through what you just did." He paused. "I'd like to hire you as a consultant." Cole blinked. Up. "What a consultant?" Henderson repeated, amused. "You tell us how to build so it doesn't fall down. We put it into official designs. Monthly stipend, regular work, your name on the report if you want it." Cole stared at him, taken aback. Not that long ago, he'd been a man with nothing but 3 coins and a horse everyone had written off. The idea that anyone, much less the government, would want his opinion on how to build anything felt like a joke. And yet the cabin around him was proof. "I'll do it," he said slowly, "on one condition." Henderson's eyebrow raised. "Name it." "I'm not leaving this place," Cole said. "If you want my help, you come up here. This cabin stays my home." Henderson looked around again at the sturdy walls and the solid chimney, at the way the light fell across the floor. He smiled. "I'd be a damn fool to move you out of the best field office I've ever seen," he said. "We'll ride up when we need you. You stay where you belong." And just like that, the $3 cabin became more than a shelter. It became headquarters. The first money Cole earned from the land office didn't go into town clothes or a nicer rifle. He didn't buy a new saddle or a fancy bed. He bought lumber, stone, roofing nails. He built a real barn along the side of the cabin. Not a lean-to cobbled together from scrap, but a sturdy structure with thick posts and sloped rafters designed to cut the northern wind. He lined the inside with straw, laid down a raised wooden platform so hooves wouldn't stand in meltwater. He built it not just for Dusty. He built it for the ones no one else wanted. The ranches around Pine Hollow had taken a beating. With barns collapsed and hay stores ruined, many families couldn't afford to keep extra mouths around, especially not mouths that didn't earn their keep. Old carriage horses, lame cow ponies, a broken-roaned mare with a cough that never quite disappeared. "They're no good to us now," one rancher said with a grimace, holding the worn lead rope of an old bay gelding. "But I heard you were taking in lost causes." "Not lost," Cole said, taking the rope gently. "Just left behind." Word spread. Over the next weeks, the new barn filled up slowly, quietly with animals whose working days were behind them. Some came in limping, some too thin, some with scars that told stories no one bothered to write down. Dusty watched every newcomer with that same calm, steady gaze. He took to pacing the barn aisle like a dignified old foreman, making inspection rounds, nosing each horse in greeting, sharing hay with the ones too shy to approach the feeder. "One day someone's gonna carve his name into a sign," Sheriff Miller joked on a visit, scratching Dusty's neck. "Dusty's home for unwanted heroes." Cole just smiled, running a hand along the horse's withers. He'd hate the attention. "Maybe so," the sheriff said. "But he's earned it." As the snow receded and mud replaced ice, Pine Hollow slowly knitted itself back together. But the town was different now. It had seen itself at its weakest and remembered who had stood strong. Young men who had once laughed at the idea of Cole's scraping clay into gaps now hiked up the ridge in groups of 2 or 3, curiosity pulling them along the trail. "Sheriff says your walls held better than the town hall," one of them said, stamping snow from his boots. "Figured we ought to learn how." Cole handed each of them a trowel. "Start by digging," he said. "You don't understand a wall until your hands have been in the dirt holding it up." They spent afternoons learning where to find the richest clay, how to mix it with straw to keep it from cracking, how to press it into the logs so wind couldn't find purchase. He showed them how to angle a roof so it didn't become a sail for the first big gust, how to anchor supports against the direction of the worst storms. He didn't lecture. He just worked and let them work beside him. Eventually their jokes faded into focused silence, brows furrowed, muscles burning the way his had months before. "You really did all this alone?" one boy asked once, pressing his palm against the solid wall. "Not alone," Cole said, glancing toward the barn where Dusty stood in the doorway watching them. "Had help?" The boy followed his gaze and nodded. "From him, from a lot of things," Cole replied. "Horses, old women with sharp tongues, blacksmiths who don't like funerals." The boys laughed and then went back to learning. One late afternoon, when the thaw had finally revealed patches of brown earth and the snow melt trickled in silver threads down the hillside, Wade Calloway rode up to the cabin. He came on a horse that wasn't as fine as the ones he'd once owned. He dismounted slowly, taking in the sight of the cabin, the added barn, the string of young colts and old mares dozing in the weak sunlight. He walked up to Cole, hands bare, hat in hand. "The ranch needs rebuilding," he said without preamble. "Barn's gone, house half ruined. I can't afford another collapse, not like that, not again." Cole watched him quietly. Wade swallowed. "I need someone who knows how to build for the wind, for the ridge. Someone who can make sure when the next storm comes, my people have a roof still over their heads." He met Cole's eyes, and really met them for the first time since he'd handed him that gun. "That someone is you." Wade finished. There it was. Not an apology exactly, but something that cost Wade just as much. "I'll pay fair," he added quickly. "More than fair. I know what your work's worth now." Cole let the words sit between them for a moment, tasting their weight. "I'll help you," he said at last. "I'll design it. I'll be there while it goes up." A hint of relief flickered across Wade's face. "But I'm not under you anymore," Cole added, voice steady. "We work as equals. My word on safety stands even if it costs you more time and money than you'd like." Wade held his gaze for a long moment. In the silence, the creek whispered somewhere below, and a bird called once from a nearby pine. "Fair enough," Wade said, finally nodding. "Castle's no good if the foundation's rotten." "You say it needs more time, it gets more time." For the first time since the blizzard, Cole extended his hand. Wade took it. The handshake wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't cold anymore either. Spring came grudgingly to the Bitterroot Valley. The snow didn't melt so much as retreat, bit by stubborn bit, revealing flattened grass and broken branches beneath. Streams swelled with runoff, carving new paths where old ones had been buried. On a mild morning, Cole leaned on the fence he'd built near the edge of the ridge and watched Dusty grazing. The old horse's coat had thickened and then shed in patches, leaving behind a healthier sheen than before. His ribs were no longer as sharp, his gait more fluid, even if still careful. He walked slowly through the new grass, lowering his head to tear off mouthfuls, ears flicking contentedly. Every so often he lifted his head and looked back toward the cabin, as if counting the other horses, checking that all was well. "You did good," Cole said softly. Dusty snorted and went back to eating. Down below, Pine Hollow was changing too. New roofs gleamed in the sun, and their angles subtly different, their beams braced according to plans that had started as sketches at Cole's table. People moved in and out of the rebuilt church, and children ran down streets that not so long ago had been buried in white silence. They had a name now for the little place on the ridge. The Ridge House folks called it, half in awe, half in affection. They came to see it, to touch the walls that had stood when everything else fell, to sit by the hearth where they'd once thawed frozen fingers and dared to believe they might see another spring. It was no longer that crazy $3 shack. It was a landmark, a story, a promise. And Cole. No one called him the ranch hand who got fired over a lame horse anymore. When his name came up in town, people said things like, "He's the man who built the cabin that didn't fall," or "Ask Cole. He'll know how to brace that beam," or simply with a kind of quiet respect, "Go talk to the man on the ridge." Sometimes late at night, when the work was done and the fire burned low, Cole would sit at his rough table, hand resting on the deed tacked to the wall. The ink was smudged, the paper yellowing at the edges. $3. $3, a stubborn refusal to pull a trigger, and a horse no one believed in. That was all it had taken to change everything. If he'd made the other choice, if he'd squeezed the trigger that day in the frozen yard, Dusty would be nothing more than a cross in a pasture. There would be no spring here, no barn full of second chances, no line of young men trudging up the ridge to learn how to build walls that could stand when the world turned white and wild. Pine Hollow would have buried more than a few roofs. He glanced toward the barn where Dusty stood in the doorway, watching him with that same quiet, unwavering gaze he'd had the day the gun never fired. "You trusted me when nobody else did," Cole murmured. "Guess the least I could do was return the favor." In town, parents told their children the story of the old horse who found the hidden spring, of the man who chose loyalty over common sense and ended up saving everyone. They spoke of how easy it was before the storm to think in terms of useful and useless, of investments and losses. They spoke differently now. Ranchers thought twice before hauling an old animal to slaughter just because its best years were behind it. People looked at each other with a little more patience, a little more awareness that worth wasn't always measured in the coins you brought home at the end of the month. That winter had taught Pine Hollow many things, but most of all, it had taught them this. Sometimes the choice that makes you look like a fool today is the one that keeps you alive tomorrow. Sometimes the thing everyone else has given up on, the $3 cabin, the half-lame horse, the man they were sure would never amount to much, is the only thing standing between you and the storm. And long after the blizzard's drifts had melted into the soil, long after new buildings rose where old ones had fallen, people would still pass the ridge and point. "That's where they survived," they'd say. "That's where he proved them all wrong." Up on the slope, with the wind softer now, and the grass slowly reclaiming the ground, Cole Bennett rested his arms on the fence, watched his old horse graze, and felt something he hadn't known he'd been missing for most of his life. Not just safety, belonging. A life that wasn't given to him by any ranch boss or land office, but forged with his own two blistered, bleeding hands. A $3 life that had turned out against all odds to be worth more than anyone, especially him, had ever expected. Thank you for staying with this story, and for believing in journeys built one hard choice at a time. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of something worth fighting for, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it. More powerful stories are coming soon.